Greetings and welcome to this episode of Let's Create Something with Stardust. Today, we're going to be setting up a fun procedural branching system with a particle plugin called Stardust. At the time I'm recording this, they've just released a new version for it, so if you're not up on the latest iteration, just take a moment and download it from superliminal.tv. It's a free update. One thing that I always love experimenting with when using complex particle systems is trails and auxiliary particles. Auxiliary particles consists of particles that are emitted from the main particles in a particle system. An example, in Cinema 4D, some particle systems like X particles by Insidium allow you to create in-depth physics simulations with an extreme level of realism when dealing with particles. In After Effects, well, it's another story. Let's not even talk about the default particle systems we get in vanilla AE. None of them include proper auxiliary particle emission. This is very sad.
It's very sad.
So when addressing particles in After Effects, most of us motion designers think about Trapcode Particular, which is a very strong and well-established particle system. It allows you to create auxiliary particles that are emitted by the main particles. In most scenarios, auxiliaries are used to create trails coming out of the main particles. And that's about as far as we can get because there is only one level of auxiliary particles, meaning that if we want to emit particles that emit particles, which themselves also emit particles, we'll have a hard time doing that using Trapcode Particular, even if we can now stack on multiple racks of particle systems in the same instance. So in order to create the kind of procedural network growing tree branching system we're aiming for in this episode, we'll need to rely on Stardust, which fortunately will allow us to set up the particle inception we're after without leaving After Effects. So let's end this little mise en contexte and let's jump right into After Effects. Alright, so now that we are here, first thing we're gonna do is create a new composition by hitting Ctrl N, and we're gonna make this one, not 1920, let's make it 720p just for the sake of recording this tutorial, and let's make this 30 frames per second, and for the duration let's put at least 720 frames, and we're gonna call this Stardust branching. Hit OK, and let's add a new solid, so Ctrl Y, let's call this Stardust, make sure it's the same size as our composition, and let's hit enter or click OK. And right from our effects and preset panel, let's fetch our Stardust effects from Superluminal, add it onto our solid, and right there, perhaps you don't see this window here. If that's not the case, probably you just need to click on this open button here, and that's gonna bring in this undocked panel here, which you can dock by dragging on the name right here and just slide it on the side right there. And here we have our fun little work area to work with our node system. So by default, what we have is a fairly standard emission of particles. And let's set that to full. First thing we're gonna do is we're gonna make sure that this only emits from the first frame. So in order to do that, we're gonna go in our emitter options here, and for the emitting drop down here, we're gonna set it to emit once. And that means it's gonna only shoot a couple of particles on the first frame, and in this case we can see only 4, so we can now increase the particle per second property right here, right up to something around 700. And here we have a little explosion just on the first frame. And right at frame 60, right at frame 61, they all disappear. That's because by default their life duration in the particle section down there, which corresponds to the particle node here. If I click on it, it's gonna highlight it right here to see where I'm at. So for the life, let's start with something like 6 seconds. So that's the decision we're gonna make, and we don't want them to go as far as that. So if we want to make them stop halfway in their motion, we've got a cool little property for that. Here is in the emitter is the speed over life. So right here this opens up a graph, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna create a new point here by just clicking right here inside the graph, and And right here we have two values here. So this corresponds to the life and the value for the speed. So we're gonna set this at something like 40 for the life, and we're gonna bring in this point here right on the middle. So 50 for the life and 50 for the value. So 50 for the value, this means 0 for the speed. In fact, if we go in between 0 and 50, the speed is going to go in the negative. So if we want the speed neutral down to 0, is to set it at 50. So right there we have, this is the life of our particle. So at first it goes at 100, so it goes at 100, it goes at 100 up to a little bit around the third of its life. It slows down and it still exists for some period of time as it is stopped. So that's what we have as our first step here, and they're gonna disappear at some point when they've been there for 6 seconds. So at frame 180, something around there. Yeah, if we want them to all be disappeared at frame 180, we can maybe put the life at 5.9, and we'll make sure that they're all be gone at the frame 180. Alright, so we can add auxiliary particles in order to make a trail onto these particles. So let's click on this button here, the little fireworks button, and that's gonna bring us a new node here, which is called auxiliary, and we can drag on the little circle here and connect it to our particle node by doing that. And as we do that, nothing should happen. That's because we need to feed something to our auxiliary. Auxiliary is like a second emitter, which acts as an emitter from the particles that are there. So it's going to shoot from those particles here. So we have to add another particle node. So right there, we can click on this button here and add a new node for the particle and connect it to our auxiliary. So by default, we're going to get a bunch of particles there. We need to change a few things. So for the auxiliary speed, we're gonna set that down to 0, and we're gonna get some trails that follows our main particles. Let's make them smaller so we can differentiate them from our main particles. So in their particle properties, in the particle effects, let's set the size down to 5, and right there we can see our little particles. I think we need to also increase the lifetime of this, so for the moment let's set them to 6. And also one thing that we need to think about, when they stop, actually they are coming to a static state at about half of their lifetime, the main particles. So we don't need to emit auxiliary particles for the trails from when they're stopped. So what we can do for that is in the auxiliary node here, down in the auxiliary section, right here we have an emit life end property. We can set that to exactly 50, because that's the point right here. At 50% of the life, it's stopped. So at 50% of the life, it has stopped emit trail as well. So we don't have leftover particles right there. All right, we can decrease the amount of particles per second in the auxiliary right until we see spaces in between. So let's bring this down until we can see it. It's made out of all these little dots, as you can see. So we want to put something not too low because we don't want to see the dots, but not too high because we don't want unnecessary processing as we render this in our previews and everything. So now we can emit something else. We're gonna make and sort that we have a second auxiliary system from this particle there. So we can just add it by clicking on here, and let's add a secondary auxiliary system to our particle. This one is going to emit only 1 particle per second. Let's start with that. And we're gonna keep the speed at 100 for the moment. Now let's add another particle node and let's connect it to our auxiliary, the one we've just created. And right away we can see that we've got some new particles that are being born, and let's run preview this for a moment. So now, as these particles are moving, they are also emitting a new level of particles. So let's add a trail to those. So one more auxiliary here. Let's click on here, and oh yeah, perhaps before we do that, let's just make sure that these particles stop at halfway of their total lifetime. So let's do the same as we did earlier, and let's copy our speed over life graph here from our emitter. So let's copy that, and let's get into the auxiliary. There is also a speed over life here, so let's open this up and let's just paste that. So our particles are being born and they are stopping at the exact middle of their lifetime. So let's maybe make these particles, let's make their total life 5 seconds, and let's see what we've got. Also same as the auxiliary for the trail. So for this one we can also stop emitting the particles at the middle of its life. So once these particles are stopped, these particles won't be emitting from the particles that are stopped. All right, so let's make sure that this is okay. Let's connect our new auxiliary to the last level of particles, and let's make one more particle connected to that auxiliary. And right away, maybe what we can do is set this to 0 for the speed, and now we've got new trails on our new particles. Maybe we can reduce the size of this. So let's get in the last particle node here, and let's open up the particle properties, and for the size let's put something like 5, or maybe even smaller than that, 2.5. And for these particles, let's also make them smaller. So these are the ones that I want to make their size something around 8, and it's a little bit messy in there. Right now would be a great moment to perhaps look at how we can color them. So we can use color inheritance. Let's see. Let's make our first set of particles red. So let's come in this particle here, and let's go to the particle properties. We're going to just set a solid color. Pretty simple. Let's make them all pure red. So all the nodes under that are also going to inherit the color. But let's control that. So right here, right here in this auxiliary, let's get down to auxiliary section here, and in the inherit section here we can go to the color over life %, and let's draw the graph let's draw a line at 0. So we're gonna cut the inheritance from this point, and then we can set a color for this particle. So let's go to this one, and let's make those blue. And what's cool is that the trail is gonna inherit this color. So now we have 2 levels of growing particles, and let's ramp preview that to see what we get. Our little animation, we start to have growing branches from our first level of particles, and maybe we can have the trail last a little bit longer than that. And also these, let's make them last for 4 seconds, and this, let's also make it 4 seconds as well. And if we remember, it's the same for those. So at half of their lifetime, we can stop emitting. So let's get to the auxiliary, and let's type down 50 here. And also we don't need to have 100 particles per second. Let's try with 33, and we still got a nice line, so that's okay. Let's keep in mind that the less particles we have, the less amount of render time that it'll end up requiring. So that's pretty fun. Now let's add another level of particles from that. So there is no stop to this. We can go on and keep this little structure here. So each particles have two auxiliaries, one for the trail and one for the head of the other branches. So let's make another auxiliary system here that's going to come out from this particle here. And let's right away paste down our speed over life graph, because we know that this is what we want to have here. And let's add a particle here, and let's also make sure that this has, it's a bunch of particles now, but this auxiliary, let's only emit one, and this particle here, let's try to start with 3 for the lifetime, and for the color let's change that. So let's get to the in the auxiliary right on top of that. Let's get in the inherit, and for the color over life let's also shut it down by drawing the line at the 0. So now our third level of particles are going to get back to their default white color. We can have control over that right here. Let's make those of a green color, and let's reduce the size of those. So let's make these particle heads a little bit tinier, so maybe 5 or 6, as long as they're just a little bit smaller than the one that they are growing onto. Let's make trails for those by going auxiliary, and let's add that here, and let's add a particle to that, so right there. And this, we can set the speed at 0. Also make sure that we stop emitting at half of the life, and the trail has to be very, very thin, so 1 pixel wide maybe. And let's look at that. So we've got a new set of particle growing from our first one. So I think we forgot as well this here. We can stop emitting, because if we leave it at 100, they won't stop emitting from the tip of the blue branches here. So if we want them to stop earlier, like you don't want to go, you don't want the green ones to go all the way up to the tip, you can control that with this number here. And same for emit live start. So if we don't want them to start right away from the center, we can control that over here. So let's set this back to 50, and maybe we can have them start a little bit later on the branch. And let's reduce their speed as well. So instead of going 100 pixel at 100 for the speed, let's half it down, and let's emit more, so we can control that with the amount here. 2, let's try 3. We got a little bit more in there. So it's still pretty quick for the preview. And let's get at our blue particles here. We can have more of those here. It'll double the amount of our green one as well. So maybe we can have those emit not right from the center, but we can have the system wait a little bit before they start growing. They won't start growing right away. So maybe we can put down something like 12 here, and we'll get something like that. Another thing that we can do in terms of inheritance is, for example, the blue particles here on this auxiliary, when they emit, let's set the speed to a smaller value, like 20. They won't go as far, but we can inherit the speed from the main particles, which will make and sort that it'll grow even more naturally. So right in the inherit here, not the color over life, but the velocity, let's inherit like 33% of the velocity. They'll follow the the direction of the red streaks as they grow. So we can even shut down the speed entirely here, but they'll have no angle at all, so we need at least a little bit here just to get an angle, but this will make them grow, like they'll inherit the speed of those particles here. So that's pretty interesting. Let's increase the speed here instead. And we can do the same on the green one. So let's get down to the auxiliary here. And for the speed, we have it at 50. Let's try 20. Now they don't grow as far. And let's inherit the velocity here. So they'll follow the direction of the blue branches they are growing on, which is quite logic in terms of growing things. So we can make them last a little bit longer. Now they seem to pop out of existence. That one thing that we could do, and let's just test our first system. So let's close down everything. I just hit Control A to select all, and I closed them all. So let's minimize. Let's hide all of those. So we just back with our main system, and for the main particles, the tip here, let's have them shrink down at the end of their life. So let's go to the particle here over life. We've got a size graph here, and we can get one of those presets. So let's get this one here, and let's apply that. And right at the end here, let's bring those dots right here. We can have those instead of popping out of existence, they'll shrink down according to the curve on this graph here. So let's try to match the lifetime, like if we wanted them to retract and then time it with the shrinking down of the tip of the particle. So let's go to this particle here, the lifetime. Let's try 5 instead. Let's try 4. So they'll shrink down, and if we put 3, so it'll synchronize them with the shrinking of the trails. We've got the shrinking of the tips of our branches here. So we can do the same for all the other systems. And let's not be afraid to copy our preset here for the particle size. And let's get to this one here, over life size. Let's paste that here, and let's get right here. Let's do the same on the over life size, and let's paste that there. And we can do the same trick to try to time those particles accordingly. So I would like them to stay on for a little longer than that, actually. So yeah, and one more thing that we can do perhaps before I leave you on to go play around with this, let's try to add some turbulence to that. So right there we've got this little button here for the turbulence, and let's only link it to our main particle for the moment. And as we try that, we might want to shut everything down just to see how it affects our red particles and trails. So let's add some position offset, not too much, and whoa, right there. There going in every direction. That's quite fast, so we might want to go down on the noise frequency here. So let's try that. So a little bit more of an organic growth here. Let's change the noise scale, so let's put something a little bit smaller maybe, or once again let's try to put something so big that it'll make nice subtle curving. So that's something that you can also play around with. Let's re-enable all this, so all these particles will still grow I think on the right spots, but they'll all be straight. They won't be affected by this. So if we wanted to affect everything with the same settings, I think we can simply link that same node here to our other systems. Can we do that? Or like this is the tip, like the one underneath to the one on top right there. So let's do that. And I don't think that it works correctly. So what we can do to make sure that they grow at the right place, they take root in the branch, is we can turn the turbulence on over time. So here in the turbulence, we've got this turbulence over life. We can have it start at 0 for a little while and then have it come in gradually. And we can even add curves in there. So instead of linear, let's hit Bezier and let's add a point here. And now we have 2 points. So I want to bring this one back here and whoop, and try to do something like that. A little bit more of a curve here. And I think they'll still grow from the right area. Let's connect. I mean there, this to that. And yeah, now we have some pretty interesting stuff going on with our particle system. Now perhaps I want my red particles to stay there a little bit longer than that, so I'll go back to the emitter, I mean the particle, and that's not long enough, so let's have them last for 12 seconds. That means that instead of stopping at half their life, they're gonna stop at the quarter of their life, so we can keep all the rest at the same values. So let's put 25, 50 here, 25 for the life and 50 for the value, or 26. I want 25 there, and also on the auxiliary here, on both of these auxiliary, let's go back to the inherit settings. And here we can put 25 instead of 50. Same for this one. 25. And this for the trail, we can have it last 6 seconds instead of 12. So we'll have them stay a little bit more while the others are there. And since we have them stop emitting once they hit the tip there, we won't have that much of them growing on the tip. And let's get back to our blue particles. Our blue particles, let's have them grow a little bit closer to the center there. So 6 instead of 12. Yeah, and let's reduce the size and the speed for our green ones. So let's get to the particle here, or the auxiliary here, and for the speed let's set it to 10, and the inheritance of velocity, let's set that to, I don't know, 16. And perhaps it'll be interesting to get different turbulences. Like this one is good for the first level, but it's a little too big for the last level. So let's have this connected just to the first one, and say that we want one turbulence, we want varying turbulences for each of our levels. We can simply start with this and duplicate it by hitting Ctrl D, and now it's connected to nothing, so it'll affect everything. This is how things inherits in there. So we want to connect it directly on this particle here. And now we can have it affect a little bit less of deposition for the blue. So that's a little bit nicer, like a nice tree branch system with growing flowers on here. If you want to take the time to use flower models and all, instead of plain circles here, but that's still cool. And the noise frequency, maybe you can increase it a little bit. And is it affecting it? It doesn't seem to have any did something wrong with this. Let's unconnect it and let's drag this there. Yeah, okay, now we have it like we want, but let's have this down to 130, and the noise amplitude, maybe you can set this 30. And let's try 100 here for that. So yeah, let's also duplicate this system to get a third turbulence. And this one, let's make sure we unselect all and let's connect it to the top with the bottom. This particle system here. And let's have it have even a lesser effect. And we can change the offset here, so it'll act as it'll vary the fractal used to trace the paths. Let's increase the noise frequency a little bit, maybe. So that's how we can get some variations. So that's pretty fun, and we could keep on pushing it further, but I think that's going to be enough for this episode. We're already over 30 minutes. So just a quick reminder that We can change the seed here, so let's get in the emitter. And one way to quickly browse through several variations of this is to go in the emitter and change the random seed here. So if we change the random seed here, we'll see different generation, we'll see different seeds, we'll have it generated in multiple ways. So let's get back to, there's something I want to change in here in our first turbulence. So we don't need that much of a curve here. We can have it start the turbulence right at the beginning of the life, just for the first row of particles, because for the next ones we'll need it gradually increasing, or else they won't be born, they won't take root in the right areas. So yeah, we can go back in the main emitter. Let's try more particles and more, and of course we could make this all 3D and add the physics simulation, but we won't get this deep in this tutorial. Let's try to change the speed random for the main particles, so they'll all have different lengths. So we could make them 3D, but we're not going to do that now. Maybe in an upcoming episode, I don't know. Just for the moment, what we could do is get some cheap shadows. So inside each particle here, we can go in the shadow property and turn them on. So that's not gonna be like, that's gonna just be a little drop shadow. So let's maybe turn them on each of those particles here and see what we'll get. Shadow on, and mostly on the trails, I suppose. Let's go right here on the shadow properties. Am I on the right one? No, this is the right one. I'll have to click there to know exactly where I am. So let's get in the shadow, let's turn this on, and let's turn this on this one. Shadow properties, turn this on, and let's turn this on. Mostly on the auxiliaries, we don't need it on the main one, so we'll get some kind of shadowing. It's not true shadows, but it adds a little bit more details there. So we can even put a reddish color, perhaps it'll be more fitting, and we can increase the opacity of it, increase its blurriness, size, depending on what we're trying to get here. We'll have a little bit more shadow, but as you can see, we're getting back, we can see our circles again. So now always tweak things accordingly. So let's add more, and it'll make our shadow darker, of course. So it's always a lot of testing until you find the right combination for all these settings here. And here we have our little node structure here, which is pretty fun to look at. We can use this little gray square here to move around in this window here. So yeah, I think we're gonna stop right here for this episode, and don't hesitate to hit me up with examples of what you created with this technique. I hope you're as thrilled as I am to play around with this. And as always, thank you for watching, and see you next time.